The title that I hope is more appropriate and gives you an understanding of what I'll be talking about is on comparisons, classics in the era of imperial expansion. So I will be discussing the role of classics in colonial India broadly, and specifically, as I said, on comparisons as a scholarly practice and what it achieved in this period. And I'll review the use of classical models of empire, why there was a distinct turn to classical antiquity, to examples of empire in the ancient past, classical Greece and Rome. Then I want to turn to how classical models were appropriated by colonial administrators for legitimizing British imperial expansion and rule over alien peoples, and also why they subsequently then discarded those models after gaining the experience of administering the empire and the expansion of the British Empire into South Asia. And secondly, I'll turn to the emergence of a new framework for comparison after the discovery of the Indo-European concept in the late 18th century, and the construction of a classical India and how the idea of progress was critical in this new era of comparisons. There are two prominent arenas in which classics or classical scholarship have impacted our understanding of, or these are two prominent areas in which classics or classical scholarship have impacted our understanding of colonial India. For the British Empire, as now it has been fairly established, the classical past became a vast resource for understanding its role in the colonies and specifically in India, as the British Empire, as a distinctively and self-fashioned modern empire, was expanding in a period of the parallel rise of discourses on popular sovereignty in Britain, as well as in Europe and the Americas. Liberalism sought justification for empire. Unlike their contemporaries, the imperial formations of Russia, the Qing in China, the Ottomans, or the Mughals, the British initially were reluctant to see themselves as an empire. They were, after all, in Africa and Asia, a trading company that built up a vast network of ports and factories. And when it was no longer possible to deny that they were indeed an empire, especially after the territorial conquest of the 18th century, specifically the Battle of Plassey in Bengal and the wars against Tipu Sultan of Mysore in South India, and after the many scandals of empire, including the controversial trials of Robert Clive and Warren Hastings, the British saw their new territorial conquest in India as an empire, right? So this shift happens in the 18th century. So not any empire, rather a modern empire whose political power derived from a constitutional monarchy based upon liberal principles of representative government. The Ottoman, the Qing, or the Russian empires, those empires were deemed unenlightened in the sense that they were categorized as despotic, not role models for shaping the expansion of the British Empire. Ottoman and other Oriental empires were templates for understanding and elaborating ideas of despotism, which also stretched into the Mughal Empire in South Asia, as well as the Mughal Empire that was in power in South Asia before the ascendance of the British in the 18th century. The British Empire was not a despotic empire. It didn't see itself as a despotic empire. It would be legitimized as an enlightened empire. Therefore, a strategy for imperial territorial expansion and conquest had to take into account Britain's own liberal political standing in the world at the time, in the 19th century. The idea of seeking political antecedents in classical Greece and Rome for for present imperial expansion and rule was to establish their legitimacy globally in a world of empires. But this was also during the era of increasing democratization, as I've just noted. Since the revolutions in America, France, and Haiti inaugurated new political imaginaries and discourse, a new world that overthrew monarchical rule in favor of a turn to popular sovereignty, or sovereignty based on power derived from the people. The experiment in democracy spread throughout Europe and the New World. Not unsurprisingly, revolutionary France and America also looked to classical Rome for models of a republican form of government based on principles of self-government. And importantly, that this conception of a republican form of government would allow for the flourishing of liberty, right? The British, too, turned to Rome for legitimizing their imperial pursuits and for showing that, in fact, empire, too, can be in congruence with ancient conceptions of liberty. However, for empire and conceptions of liberty to coexist, liberals turned to emerging discourses of race, the civilizing mission, and ideologies of progress to legitimize the expansion of empire and to justify imperial rule. In other words, the elaboration of race and racial difference between the world's peoples provided the framework and justification for imperial expansion. Okay, so here's one slide, the first slide, and it is the map of the Imperial Federation from 1886. And it's a map of the world showing the extent of the British Empire at the time in 1886. But what's most interesting is really the illustrations, right? And I have a close-up of the bottom part of the map where you can see, Britannia on the world. You see, kind of symbols of the empire, the tiger, the peacock. Here's the, kind of Indian prince, the Maharaja on an elephant. And then also, indigenous people of Australia, the kangaroo. So you have the representations of the reach of the British Empire. I'm just going to go back to the full map where you can see, if you notice the words printed across the top of the map, freedom, fraternity, and federation, right? Freedom, fraternity, and federation. Freedom and fraternity are tied to revolutionary rhetoric of popular sovereignty from both the American and French variety, while federation provided an imperial frame for freedom and fraternity to flourish, right? Federation as a kind of political structure that would accommodate for the flourishing of these ideals of freedom and as well as fraternity, the coming together of these communities spread across the globe. That the ideals of freedom can in fact coexist with an imperial frame, right? So that's, to me, what's interesting about this idea of imperial federation as well. And as I, indicated earlier, that in this kind of revolutionary, post-revolutionary era, that any imperial enterprise also had to legitimize it as, congruent with the ideals of equality and other, concepts connected to popular sovereignty that's reshaping Europe itself, right, at the metropole. So that the ideals of freedom can coexist with an imperial frame. The question is how, and there are many threads to follow in 19th century intellectual thought to trace how this was discussed and resolved, the problem of liberty and empire. the turn to classical models of empire seemed natural in that classical antiquity, Greece in particular, was it was in circulation, as was elevated by Romanticism or Romantic Hellenism, and thus enjoyed high status in the 19th century and 19th century elaborations of Western civilization, and therefore also impacted, one can argue, the construction of Western supremacy as well. Western supremacy built on the ideas of progress and civilizational achievement. These are the concepts that come up in ideologies of empire, right, in the 19th century. So if you look to 19th century discourses of the civilizing mission that both the French and British empires articulated and elaborated, the colonized were seen as primitive, right? Too primitive to rule themselves, right? And this is how race comes in to legitimize imperial rule and colonial rule. The construction of the West as reaching levels of achievement surpassing even classical antiquity was also articulated by the Anglicists in British India, colonial administrators who most prominently represented by Thomas Macaulay, as well as Charles Trevelyan. Prior to that turn, the ancient worlds of Greece and Rome were central to the construction of the West. Ideologies of progress and the civilizing mission of modern empires led to British thinkers seeing themselves as surpassing the ancients in this regard. But the idea of civilization and achievement was also based on their understanding and construction of classical antiquity. In contrast to the West and what it stood for, from classical antiquity to British imperial achievements, stood the East, or the elaboration of Eastern difference, Eastern civilizations, and of course, racial difference. Race thinking and hierarchies of race became important in marking the difference between the East and West, especially so after the discovery of the Indo-European concept. This comes from James Reynolds' map, the cartouche of the 1782 map depicts, according to Reynolds himself, quote, Britannia receiving into her protection the sacred books of the Hindus, represented by the Pandits. In the picture, as you can see, the three Brahmins who are handing over texts, the Shastras, or the sacred texts of the Hindus. He continues, in allusion to the humane interposition of the British legislature in favor of the natives of Bengal in the year 1781, Britannia is supported by a pedestal on which are engraven the victories by means of which the British nation obtained and has hitherto upheld its influence in India, amongst which the two recent ones of Porto Novo and Sholingur, gained by General Coote, are particularly pointed out by a sepoy to his comrade. So you can see the sepoys over here, Britannia over here, the pundits over here, the texts, right? So it's all kind of contained in this representation. This epitomizes the imperial encounter, especially so in the late 18th century in India and the early part of the 19th century as well. In that kind of encounter and exchange, right, that it depicts. The scholarship and research on this particular aspect of the reception of classics has been quite extensive in the last 2-3 decades on the elaboration of Western civilizational superiority built upon the imperial conquest of so-called weaker nations and peoples in empire studies as well as in political thought. The linking of Western civilization with classical antiquity has a longer history, one that this audience is certainly familiar with, as scholars have responded to Martin Bernal and his 2 volumes on classical scholarship. Black Athena have pointed out the constructedness, right, of that history, tying classical antiquity with the constitution of modern Western Europe. There are a few key points from Black Athena and Bernal's arguments that are important. The Phil-Hellenic construction of Greece as exemplifying the idea of freedom or liberty, which also placed so-called Oriental civilizations on a lower scale because of their purported natural weakness and passivity. And in imperial discourse, that translates to those civilizational characteristics of weakness or passivity would lead to their conquest. The other key argument from Bernal is the impact of the European discovery of the Indo-European concept, linking Indian languages with European ones. So let's delve into how race then intersected with these two arguments. Recent scholarship on Victorian ideologies of rule has shown that there was a turn away from classical models of empire, that the conception of Greater Britain received much more traction in the latter half of the 19th century. For instance, the work of Duncan Bell, he writes about how Victorians turned away from classical Rome and Greece and looked to the New World for an enduring political model, new imperial futures, and the idea of federation from the United States as an appropriate model, for how to think about Greater Britain after the experience of empire. The reason Victorians turned away from classical models of empire was that the historical examples actually point to their eventual dissolution, not dissolution, maybe that too as well. Intellectual historians of the US also point to the decline of classical antiquity in the 19th century. With the idea of federation or Greater Britain, such a model could potentially be more enduring for political futures, right? Bell's argument is that classical examples of empire, namely Rome, were in decline in the 19th century because historically the Roman Empire eventually fell. So certainly not a model to build upon for the long term, especially when you have these parallel discourses that are arguing that Britain has surpassed Rome in any case, and it needs to forge something new, right? In the 19th century, for colonial administrators and more broadly defenders of empire, the idea was to build an enduring political form for the expansion of empire globally, competing with other imperial powers, France, Russia, Japan, Germany, Italy, and a governing structure that would be sustainable in the colonies. It's an interesting contrast with the French imperial conundrum at the end of empire, post-World War II, which was to turn away from federation models or confederation models, as such models would entail positing equality between the colonized and the colonizers. So in the 19th century, when the French Empire was expanding, the French had to reconcile their aggressive imperial expansion with their republican ideals. The discourse of the civilizing mission as the purpose of empire was based upon the idea of French cultural or civilizational superiority, and what scholars have called also a belief in the perfectibility of humankind. So those are what kind of prop up this idea of civilizational superiority, right? Or the civilizing mission itself, a belief in the perfectibility of humankind. There's a similar logic in British imperial discourse, though the main contrast between the French and the British by the late 19th century was that British imperial policy took the route of upholding native traditions and institutions, and thereby also upholding or recognizing racial difference, marking racial difference. This was colonial policy that purported to prop up native institutions after the 1857 revolt. In India, 1857 revolt in India, in British India. The ideology was that there was an enduring racial difference between the colonizer and the colonized, that the difference between the rulers and the ruled was based upon race, racial difference, and racial hierarchies. When the Greater Britain idea came into popularity in the last decades of the 19th century, the conception of Greater Britain implied that a federation of like-minded peoples or Western civilization allowed for cooperation between settler colonies and metropolitan Britain. Such an experiment would not work with the other races, such as with Indians. Even earlier in the 19th century, in the 1830s, for instance, Charles Trevelyan, in his Education of the Peoples of India, also proposed a turn away from ancient Rome and argued that the British in the 19th century actually surpassed, right, the historical example of Rome, and therefore the British should even be more ambitious and seek to forge uncharted territory for governing people who are unable to govern themselves. To return to Bell's discussion of the turn to federation or an idea of Greater Britain, scholars have pointed out the different uses of Greece and Rome, and that they were, what these different uses of pointed out the different uses of Greece and Rome were that Greek colonies were models for settler colonialism, for instance, while Rome provided a framework to civilize peoples on the lower end of the scale of civilization. So theories of race and racial hierarchies determine which model was appropriate for imperial policy and legitimacy. So the charge of despotism of the Eastern empires also fed into this racial hierarchies. Tenuous as those ties were, tying classical antiquity directly to Britain and its empire, it might be interesting to recall, as Feroz Vasunia in his Classics and Colonial India volume recounts how Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India, who was very prolific in writing histories of India, in his Discovery of India, called into question the idea that Western European origins lie in ancient Greece. So Vasunia, was pointing out that Nehru himself, writing this in the first half of the 20th century, calls into question the idea that Western European origins lie in ancient Greece. Vasunia argues how I think I'm referring to here Nehru, was invested in conjuring an ancient Greece as wholly so he brought this up in order to talk about how ancient Greece is conceptualized as disconnected with modern Greece. This is a discussion that Vasunia has about this disconnect between modern Greece and ancient Greece. So when Sir William Jones went to India, he saw a civilization that would give insight into ancient Greek thought and religion. Almost as if by observing Indian society, Jones would be able to participate in life as it was lived by the ancient Greeks. This is not that different from a work by Johann Fabian, an anthropologist who wrote an interesting book several decades ago called Time and the Other, and he writes about how anthropologists believed by going to remote places and civilizations, they would be taken back in time to experience a different temporality, one that was located in the past. For Jones to be, Sir William Jones, to be in India studying Sanskrit and discovering Indian antiquity was such a temporal experience of experiencing classical antiquity in British India itself. So this was what I was trying to get at with Vasunia's discussion of Nehru, who questions this link between ancient Greece as being the origin of the West, right? And that could take us in a different direction in terms of why Nehru was invested in delinking that. But Vasunia then talks about how the Orientalist, Sir William Jones, saw British India as a space for kind of understanding ancient Greece, right? They experienced a different temporality. And so it reminded me of Johann Fabian's Time and the Other, and when he talks about kind of the anthropologists, those who study far off places and primitive tribes, to their own kind of sense of temporality and what they encounter in these spaces that they study. And it's similar to maybe, we can kind of think of the Orientalists, like Sir William Jones, who, when they discovered Sanskrit, as they studied Sanskrit, and the links with classical antiquity of Rome and Greece, that they then, felt that maybe their experience of India would kind of give them an insight into these ancient, temporalities, this ancient world. Comparativism and classical scholarship also shaped the reception of Oriental languages and literatures. My previous work or contribution to this scholarship on classics and empire was a close look at Macaulay and Trevelyan in their understanding of Indian languages and their what they deemed as kind of underdevelopment of Indian languages. And I was intrigued by the dissemination and reception of philological studies that led to the discovery and formulation of the Indo-European language group. For these particular scholars, the connection between the ancient world and modern England was of inheritance, but that with the current state of development and global power, England actually surpassed Greece and Rome in literary achievements, right? These were the Anglicists, Macaulay and Trevelyan, and it shaped their colonial policies of education in the colonies, in particular in British India. I want to turn to what the historian Tom Troutman has called Indophilia, not Indophobia, that characterizes, I guess, the Anglicists like the Macaulays and the Trevelyans, and their, supporting or advocating for the dissemination of English as a way to develop the literary traditions in India. But the Indophilia represents a different strand of colonial Orientalist discourse in South Asia. So Indophilia was not so much concerned with seeking imperial legitimacy as the Anglicists were. So they weren't seeking imperial legitimacy for expanding the empire. Rather, it made use of classical scholarship and knowledge to understand ancient India. Comparisons, for instance, comparisons of the gods, right, of ancient India, and connections to classical antiquity. Which the Asiatic Society of Bengal, which was the premier Orientalist society that advocated researches into Oriental languages and literatures. The Society's journal, Asiatic Research, has devoted a lot of space to these comparisons. Not only Jones, but a lot of his associates also, delved into these comparisons. And they made use of their own, connection to classical scholarship of classical antiquity to understand ancient India, how they were going to approach and reconstruct ancient India in order to further knowledge, right? So this is the Indophilia, or the Orientalists, and their connection to furthering knowledge of Asia, right, of the Orient. And in their comparisons, they also drew distinctions, right? Indophilic comparisons amounted to seeing Greece in India and the possibilities this opened up in terms of what ancient India might represent. What research, philological, would reveal in terms of ancient classical Indian art, particularly poetry and drama, and also politics, right, in terms of theories of democracy, for instance. Since I've been talking Sir William Jones, here's a depiction of William Jones with, again, some native Brahmins and Pundits. This is at University College's chapel at Oxford. This is a depiction of Sir William Jones, and he is portrayed as sitting under a banana tree, and then taking notes from Hindu Brahmins or Hindu Pundits who are explaining their ancient texts, right? So it says, underneath it says, he formed a digest of Hindu and Muhammadan laws. So William Jones, as you may all know, was like the prominent Orientalist associated with the founding of the Asiatic Society of Bengal in the 1780s. He had the patronage of the Governor General at the time, Warren Hastings, and he was already, trained in classics, Latin and Greek, but also had learned Persian and Arabic before he set out to Calcutta, the colonial city of Calcutta. And when he comes to Calcutta, he then begins to learn Sanskrit and from the Hindu Pundits. And he begins to see similarities, right? He's attributed with the discovery of the Indo-European concept, where he makes these comparisons between Greek and Latin and the structure of Sanskrit, the language, right? And but here the depiction is also, as a judge, that he was also critical in gathering the law codes, the personal law codes for both the Hindus and Muslims in British India, and this is in Calcutta. There's another. I have another. There's so many depictions, but here's Sir William Jones in St. Paul's Cathedral in London. I haven't seen either of them actually in person. I don't think I ever made it inside St. Paul's Cathedral for some reason. So I haven't seen it in person, but I gathered these pictures from the web. So this is a monument to Sir William Jones. And here you can see, I think if you can see that, I don't know if you can see, but this is a depiction of a Hindu god, the head here, and it, I think it also says, referring to the avatars of the god Vishnu. So you see, so interesting depictions there, and of course in his classical attire, right, of William Jones himself. So the discoveries made by Sir William Jones and the scholars at the Asiatic Society of Bengal were documented in their society's journal, Asiatic Researches. And this is something I, went through for my own work on antiquarianism, but there were lots of interesting classical, kind of references, not just the gods and these kind of, drawing parallels between the classical worlds of Greece and Sanskrit or India, but it was what I'm trying to kind of lay out here is to see how classics kind of shaped their understanding of ancient India and kind of shaped it in such a way that there were, through the act of comparison, this method of comparativism, shaped a periodization and an understanding of what the classical period was, even in India, right, in South Asia. So the discoveries So the Asiatic Researches was a journal that came out of the Asiatic Society of Bengal in Calcutta, but there were also similar journals in England and in Europe. This knowledge was being consumed in Paris and in Germany as well. So there were other Asiatic Orientalist associations, societies, for sharing knowledge and researches on the Orient in continental Europe as well. So the discoveries were made in comparison to what they knew from classical antiquity and Western European literary traditions, especially in their discoveries of Sanskrit and its textual traditions, particularly the literary traditions. In the preface to Jones' translation of Kalidasa's Shakuntala, Kalidasa was a 4th century CE playwright from the court of the Guptas, or the Gupta Empire or dynasty, however you see it. In the preface to his translation of Kalidasa's Shakuntala, he writes that he began to translate this play, one of Kalidasa's most famous plays, as natak, or the Sanskrit word for play, verbally, quote, verbally into Latin, which bears so great a resemblance to Sanskrit, end of quote, than English. Jones then translates into English in order to publish it. But the process that Jones reveals is how he discovered that this text, his Indian informant or Pandit revealed to him was a play. The revelation comes from the Pandit explaining to Jones what Shakuntala resembled, this text. And this actually reminded me of Borges's short story Averroes' Search from his short story collection Labyrinths, where Averroes, who is working on a commentary on Aristotle, is unable to recognize the genre of the play, of a play or performance art, tragedy and comedy, and is unable to translate them into Arabic. Jones writes about his assistant Pandit describing this natak or play and how it was in the past performed in a similar manner to the English plays that were being enacted in the colonial city of Calcutta. So this is how the Pandit explains to Jones, and Jones then tries to understand what this text Shakuntala is. This exchange reveals the ways in which translation took place between Pandit scholars and European Orientalists. Also, that because of the closeness of Sanskrit to Latin, right, that's what Jones says, it had to be translated into English via Latin, right? This revealed to Jones that there was a rich tradition of plays or a dramatic tradition in Sanskrit. A volume from the 1960s called Literatures of India and also modern translations of Shakuntala allude to possible Greek origins of Sanskrit drama, though without any real evidence to make this argument. It is similar to colonial scholars' discussions of Gandhara art, for instance, and sculpture of Buddha in and around the ancient city of Takshashila. They saw this art as derivative of Greece via the Indo-Greek kingdoms in that region after the death of Alexander the Great in the 3rd century BCE. The idea that classical Sanskrit literature and art was influenced by Greek traditions, again, is based on the assumption that classical Greece was not only superior, but that it must have been the origin of classical Sanskrit literary forms as well as art, right, aesthetics. With the Orientalists based in Calcutta researching the classical past of India, Jones essentially established a kind of classical tradition in India. His discovery of the Indo-European concept and lineage helped to construct the idea of a classical period in Indian history. Vesunia, as well as other classicists such as James Porter, writes about the formation of the category of classics. And that's something I think would be interesting to push further in not only within Western study classical scholarship, but also to think through the category of classics and how it emerged in understanding in the periodization in Indian history as well, right? What is classical Sanskrit? How does one define that, right? What makes it classical? That classics in the 19th century British India, during the heyday of Orientalist scholarship, included Arabic, Persian, and Sanskrit, because the category expanded with the researchers coming out of the Asiatic Society of Bengal and what Raymond Schwab called the Oriental Renaissance. While in England, there was still a traditional adherence to classics, this is Vasunia, as being tied to Greco-Roman antiquity. This adherence to Greek and Latin as constituting the classical tradition was connected to the construction of a Western civilization that was also superior to other world civilizations, contemporary world civilizations. And this was propped up, as I suggested before, by racial hierarchies and the historical kind of expansion of the British Empire. However, in British India, the construction of a classical tradition constitutive of classical Sanskrit led to an Indian Renaissance of sorts as well. A rediscovery of the classics with translations into regional languages as well as in visual arts, particularly painting in the 19th century India. For instance, in 1876, at a Madras exhibition, Raja Ravi Varma presented his painting of Shakuntala, writing a love letter to Dushyanta, the king Dushyanta, and other paintings of classical Sanskrit literature, mainly works of Kalidasa. So Kalidasa becomes also, a classical, epitomizes, right, the classical period. Raja Ravi Varma's realism, his painting style, also represents an idea of classical period of Indian history, epitomized by Kalidasa's poetic works. So the discovery of early Indian history and classical India began with the Asiatic researches, Orientalist and Indo-Philic reconstruction of ancient India. Vasunia writes on Sir William Jones's work on Indian gods and comparisons to the Greek ones. This suggested to Jones the intimate connection between classical Greek culture and Indian culture. The Indo-European idea was that at some point in the past, the Greeks and Indians were one, right? This is what was established by historical philology, which gave way to parallel trajectories. However, Jones and other Orientalists thought of India as stuck in a time warp, right? Giving Europe a glimpse of what ancient Greece would have been like. Jones references India as the classical past that can be experienced by contemporary Europeans. Max Muller, another Orientalist and Sanskritist, in his book called India, What Can It Teach Us?, articulates this idea that British India can give Europeans a glimpse of their own past or a new historical consciousness. This is Max Muller on what these discoveries meant for the intellectual history of Europe. This is a quote by Muller. Quote, "I remember, I say, one of our masters telling us one afternoon when it was too hot to do any serious work that there was a language spoken in India which was much the same as Greek and Latin, nay, as German and Russian. At first we thought it was a joke, but when we saw the parallel columns of numerals, pronouns, and verbs in Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin written on the blackboard, one felt in the presence of facts before which one had to bow. All one's ideas of Adam and Eve and the paradise and the Tower of Babel and Shem, Ham, and Japheth, with Homer and Aeneas and Virgil too, seemed to be whirling round and round till at last one picked up the fragments and tried to build up a new world and to live with the new historical consciousness." End of quote. This is from Muller's India, What Can It Teach Us? So in conclusion, just a couple of thoughts. The Indo-European idea the Indo-European idea and the so-called European discovery of the links between Sanskrit, Persian, and European languages led to what one Indian literary scholar, G.N. Devi, once called a kind of colonial amnesia, or a forgetting of a previous global world of letters. The Indo-European idea inaugurated a new discourse of comparison, with the center of comparison as being situated with a new idea of the ancient world as the origin of the West and Western literary traditions. There has been a lot of work on complicating the idea of the ancient worlds of Greece and Rome as the property of the West, as well as complicating the modern constructions of Greece as devoid of Eastern influence, or that ideas, in other words, that ideas travel both ways, right? And of course, that there were earlier constructions of East and West, not framed by the ideologies of rule propped up by modern imperialisms. So restoring the history of a kind of circulation of ideas before the Indo-European moment frees up our understanding of constructions of the West and Western civilization, and also maybe constructions of Western supremacy. Also, our understanding of literary history in South Asia would be complicated, such as investigating, studying the origins of theater, poetry, and prose, to restore the history of circulation of ideas or a global world of letters would be to contest these problematic narratives of Indian classical traditions being derivative of the West, right? Whether in the ancient past, via Indo-Greek kingdoms, or during the colonial period. And I will end it at this.